This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 286 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before we dig into this week's 10 trends, I wanted to remind you guys to check out OddsFire. It's a really cool tool for your research, whether it's for sports betting, daily fantasy football, or even your season-long leagues. You can shop for the best lines in each market and see which side is getting the most bets and money, and that's helpful when making decisions in fantasy football. OddsFire is the premier odds comparison experience across major bookmakers in the regulated U.S. market. Never settle. Always get the best odds. Check out the experience for free now on oddsfire.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. The first trend for today's show is that the Rams running backs have seen 7.7% of the team's targets this year. Not only is that the lowest mark in the league, but no other team is below 10.9%. Now, Todd Gurley made a living getting targeted out of the backfield under Sean McVay, and those have essentially evaporated through 3 weeks. He's averaging just 2 targets per game when he averaged almost 6 per game last season. As a result, Gurley's just not been the fantasy asset that a lot of people were hoping for when they drafted him in the second round back in August. And I don't think that we can just assume the Rams are going to start using their running backs more as receivers. I should say I would be surprised if they kept up this pace, but I don't see regression to the mean from the standpoint of them getting close to how they utilized Todd Gurley over the last couple of seasons. So Gurley may see some uptick in receiving volume, but I wouldn't bank on 5 targets per game moving forward. New England has run 0 plays while trailing this season. Denver, they lead the league in plays while trailing at 208. The weird part with Denver is that they actually have a below average pass to rush attempt ratio this year, which means they really don't trust Joe Flacco. They're trailing a lot and they still have a low ratio. So these negative game scripts haven't even benefited the team's pass catchers as much as it could. Then with New England, we need to panic about Sony Michel. I had him as a sell candidate on last week's 15 transaction show, and this is precisely why. New England's had positive game scripts all season long, and Michel hasn't done a whole lot despite that. Maybe they're saving him for later in the season, but even still, you don't have time to wait around. Unlike the Patriots, you're not guaranteed a playoff spot this year. Trend number 3 is that based on his rushing and receiving yardage totals, Jeff Wilson should have .36 touchdowns this season. Instead, he has 4. That's the largest discrepancy in the entire league. Now, these totals are compared to the average for running backs over the last 5 years. So I'm looking at how many rushing yards typically have equated to a rushing touchdown over this time period, which is 145 yards. And I'm doing the same for receiving. And thus far, Jeff Wilson should have just .36 touchdowns based on his yardage total. Now, clearly, he's seen work in high leverage situations, which changes this formula a bit. We're just trying to spot outliers at a high level here, though. But Wilson is on top of that list with Mark Ingram at number 2 and Derrick Henry at number 3 among running backs. Jimmy Graham saw 21.4% of Green Bay's targets in Week 1 against Chicago. In his 2 games since, he's failed to reach a 6% target share, and his target share has gone down week over week. This is really just to say that Jimmy Graham probably can't be relied upon week in and week out like some of you were hoping for after Week 1. The workload just isn't there. Meanwhile, Trend 5 tells us a different story about another tight end. Darren Waller has over 30% of Oakland's targets through 3 weeks. George Kittle is second in tight end target share, but he's under 25%. So yes, that means that Darren Waller has by far the highest target share among tight ends to start the year. The strange thing with these higher targeted tight ends this season, though, has been their lack of scoring. Waller doesn't have a touchdown. Kittle doesn't have a touchdown. Kelsey has just 1. Ertz hasn't scored. Expect that to regress positively moving forward. Waller does look like the late round tight end this year, though, based on volume alone. But there have been a lot of other good ones too, like Mark Andrews and Delaney Walker. The next trend is that the Broncos still don't have a sack this season. I have no idea how this is possible with the talent that they have on defense and a defensive-minded head coach. And they've faced Chicago, Oakland, and Green Bay this year, teams who rank in the bottom half of the league in sack rate. This has obviously gotten them in trouble from a fantasy perspective. Denver's defense ranked 25th in weekly scoring against Oakland in Week 1. They were 30th against Chicago, and they were 28th against Green Bay. On paper, they've got a good matchup this week at home against Jacksonville. But because of the way that they're playing defense, they're not a locked-in play like they would have been earlier in the season. Trend 7 is yet another one about the Broncos, and it's that Joe Flacco has thrown it 15 or more air yards on just 9.1% of his attempts this year. That's the lowest mark in the league when you don't count Teddy Bridgewater, who hasn't played a full 2 games. For even more context, the lowest deep ball rate among 200-plus attempt quarterbacks last year came from Nick Mullins. He threw it deep on 12.8% of his attempts. So Flacco's 9.1% rate is really, really low. And it's really, really concerning for players like Emmanuel Sanders and Cortland Sutton. But Phillip Lindsay and Royce Freeman have benefited from it. They've combined for almost 28% of Denver's targets. The Broncos have targeted their running backs at one of the higher rates in the league. And for what it's worth, Lamar Jackson is throwing it deep at the highest rate in the NFL at 32%. That's a key reason Hollywood Brown was a buy candidate this week on the 15 Transaction Show. The next trend is kind of a weird one. And it's that Devontae Parker is 4th in the NFL in air yards through 3 weeks. And he's also 4th in targets that have traveled 15 or more air yards. We actually should expect some positive regression for Parker moving forward. I know his situation is trash. It's horrendous. And I know he's caught just 6 of his 20 targets this year. But there's no place to go for the Dolphins team but up, right? Right? Maybe? He's worth a roster spot in deeper formats at least. I just wouldn't expect him to become some weekly reliable option given how that team is functioning. Trend 9 is that Emmanuel Sanders, Preston Williams, and Taylor Gabriel all have 100% of their team's receiving touchdowns to start the year. That's because the Broncos have just 2 passing touchdowns, the Dolphins have 1, and the Bears have 3. And actually, there's a regression alert that stems from this trend. Cortland Sutton suffered from the lack of touchdowns, and he now has the second most receiving yards at wide receiver without a score. If I felt better about Joe Flacco throwing the ball down the field, I'd consider Sutton a buy candidate. But right now, he's simply a positive regression candidate. That's a lot less fun. The final trend today is that only 2 teams have neutral script pass to rush attempt ratios below 1. A couple of teams are actually exactly at 1, but just 2 of them are below 1. And these are teams that are running it more than passing it when games are within 6 points. The first is a fairly obvious one, and that's Baltimore. They're at 0.93. The other one, though, and they actually have the lowest in the NFL, is San Francisco at 0.86. This doesn't bode well for the fantasy options in that offense. George Kittle, as I mentioned earlier, has a good target share in the offense, but the highest target share for a wide receiver is Deebo Samuel. He's under 17%. And the rest of the pass catchers are under 10%. And that's of an overall passing pie that's clearly not very big. So I hate to say it, but the only player who's going to give you reliable production, despite this offense operating fairly well, might be George Kittle this season, at least through the air. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And if you could do me a favor, if you listen to this show through Apple Podcasts, leave the show a rating and review. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. I'm on there throughout the week tweeting trends similar to the ones that you hear on this show, and I'm also answering your fantasy football questions. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Matchup Show.